Hello and welcome to Sleep to Stories. And in today's story, we look at a night in New York City when a man did everything he could to protect himself from the dark outside. He locked his heavy doors, secured his windows, and turned his home into a sealed box. Yet, within minutes of closing his doors for the night, someone took his life, leaving behind a locked room with no way in and no way out. Investigators were left staring at a crime that seemed physically impossible. If you are the kind of person who likes drifting off to stories like this one, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and turning on notifications. It really helps the channel grow, and it allows me to bring you more quiet mysteries every week. But for now, let's get back to it. In March of 1929, in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, a man named Isidor Fink ran a small laundry business. He was an immigrant from Galicia, a region in Europe, and he lived alone in the back of his shop at 4 East 132nd Street. Isidor was a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself. But those who knew him noticed something very specific about his behavior. Isidor lived in constant fear. He was deeply afraid that someone would break into his home and hurt him. Because of this fear, Isidor turned his laundry shop into a fortress. He installed extra locks on every door. He put heavy metal bolts on the windows. Every single evening, as soon as his work was done, he would lock every bolt from the inside. He wanted to make sure that no stranger could ever step inside his building. On the night of March 9, 1929, Isidor went out to deliver fresh laundry to his customers. He returned to his shop at around 10:15 in the evening. He walked through the front door, closed it tight, and locked all the heavy bolts behind him, just like he did every night. The street outside was dark and quiet. About 15 minutes later, around 10:30 in the evening, a neighbor named Mrs. Locklan Smith was resting in her apartment next door. The walls between the buildings were thin. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith heard loud, violent noises coming from Isidor's shop. It sounded like two men were fighting. She heard heavy footsteps, objects crashing, and loud shouts. Then she heard the sharp sound of gunshots. Mrs. Smith was terrified. She ran out into the cold night air to find help. Luckily, she spotted a police officer from the New York Police Department patrolling nearby. She ran up to him and explained what she had just heard. The officer immediately rushed with her to 4 East 132nd Street. When the officer arrived at the laundry shop, he tried the front door handle. It was locked firm. He knocked hard on the wood and yelled, but no one answered. The officer walked around the outside of the building to check the windows. Every single window was closed tight and locked from the inside. There were no broken panes of glass. There was no open back door. The officer checked every possible way into the building. The only unlatched opening in the entire structure was a tiny transom window above the front entrance door. A transom window is a small, narrow window placed high up above a doorway. This small window was open, but it was far too small for an adult man to climb through. At this point, the officer knew someone inside was in grave danger, but he could not break down the heavy locked door alone. He saw a young boy standing nearby on the street and asked for his assistance. The officer lifted the small boy up into the air. He carefully pushed the boy through the narrow transom window above the door. The boy dropped down safely onto the floor inside. He reached up and slid back the heavy metal bolts on the front door. The police officer pushed the door open and stepped into the dim room. Inside the dark room, police found Isidor Fink lying dead on the floor with 3 gunshot wounds. The officers immediately searched the room. They expected to find a gunman hiding in the dark, or perhaps a weapon dropped on the floor. But there was no one else inside. The room was completely empty. What nobody realized yet was how confusing the scene would become for investigators. The officers searched every corner of the room, under the tables, and through the piles of dirty laundry. They searched for the gun that killed Isidor. There was no gun anywhere. They searched the floor for spent bullet casings. There were no bullet casings anywhere in the room. At first, investigators thought this might be a robbery gone wrong. But when they searched Isidor's body, they found money still inside his pockets. They searched the rest of the room and found his wallet sitting inside a pile of laundry on the floor. The wallet was full of cash. Not a single dollar had been taken. Detectives called in forensic experts to search the room for clues. They checked for fingerprints on the door handles, the windows, and the furniture. But the experts only found 1 set of fingerprints in the entire building. They belonged to Isidor Fink. There were no strange footprints on the floor. There were no marks on the doorframe to show that anyone had forced their way inside. Every single bolt had been locked from the inside before the police arrived. The killer was gone, the gun was gone, and the room was locked tight from the inside. Now let me walk you through what investigators eventually pieced together as they tried to solve this mystery. The police commissioner of New York, a man named Edward P. Mulrooney, took personal charge of the case. He called in his best detectives to figure out how this crime could have happened. Over time, investigators focused on 2 main theories. The first theory was that the killer never actually set foot inside the laundry shop. Detectives suggested that the killer stood outside on the street, reached a hand through the open transom window above the door, and shot Isidor from above. Some officers even thought the killer might have attached a handgun to a long stick, pushed it through the tiny window, and fired down into the room. However, when investigators tested this idea, it did not make sense. The transom window was very small and high up. The angle made it almost impossible for someone outside to hit a moving person 3 times. Isidor had been shot twice in the chest and once in his hand. Furthermore, neighbor Mrs. Smith had clearly heard the sounds of 2 men physically fighting inside the room right before the shots were fired. The second theory was that Isidor was shot somewhere outside on the street. Investigators wondered if Isidor was attacked outside, managed to escape, ran back into his shop, locked all the heavy bolts behind him, and then collapsed. Medical examiners carefully studied Isidor's injuries to see if this was possible. They found that the 2 bullet wounds in his chest were extremely severe. The bullets had damaged vital organs. The doctors stated that after receiving such severe wounds, Isidor would have lost consciousness within a few seconds. He would not have had the physical strength to run inside, fasten multiple heavy locks on the door, secure the windows, and walk across the room. In the end, neither theory could explain the facts. The police could not explain how a killer could fight Isidor inside a sealed room, shoot him 3 times, take the weapon, leave no fingerprints, and lock all the doors from the inside on the way out. Police Commissioner Edward P. Mulrooney officially called the murder of Isidor Fink an insoluble mystery. That means a mystery that has no possible solution. Writer Charles Ford later noted that Isidor's story was a story of a great fear that came before a murder. To this day, no suspect has ever been identified, no weapon has ever been found, and the case remains one of the greatest locked room mysteries in history. Isidor Fink spent years locking out the world to stay safe, but those same locked doors ended up keeping his killer's secret safe forever. That's it for today's story. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, check out the rest of the channel. There are more stories like this one, with plenty more on the way. And if there is a topic you would like me to cover next time, or any thoughts about tonight's story, leave them in the comments below. This was Sleep to Stories. Good night and sleep well.